a lot of our talk is going to be structured around like, how do you get those 4 elements into your compost pile and working correctly, and what are they doing in there? But carbon matter is often referred to as your browns. That's a lot of times your, you know, leaf litter, wood chips, paper, things like that. Your nitrogen matter is more of your table scraps, you know, the iconic banana peel that everybody always thinks of with compost for some reason.
And like the always first thing that comes up is a banana peel.
Moisture content, the water, that's a really important aspect that we'll talk about later when it comes to managing your pile. But the water is what allows, you know, the microbes that are breaking down your compost to have contact with the compost itself. And obviously air, these microbes also breathe. So you have to make sure your pile is well aerated and, you know, has enough oxygen for those guys to work. So when you're making compost, you need browns, greens, water, and air.
Yeah, very basic. Obviously, there's a little bit more to it than that, but on a very general level, that's what you need. So how is compost used and why? So compost is used as a soil amendment. The finished product is called humus. Not hummus, but humus. I think a lot of people kind of avoid the word humus because you look at it and you immediately want to say hummus, and then you're like, no, I'll just say compost, you know? But the two words aren't necessarily interchangeable, but they're pretty much the same. So we won't go into the fine details of that, but compost is applied to soil to amend the soil and make it healthier. So some of the benefits here are it adds nutrients back into the soil. We'll talk a lot more about that because it's really important. It helps prevent soil erosion. A lot of times people amend their soils with compost in order to do this. And of course, it reduces waste from these landfills. It diverts it into a natural system instead of overfilling all of our landfills. And then reduces methane, and methane is produced a lot of times in landfills, and it's produced when organic matter anaerobically breaks down. So well, I don't know if you want to go into a little bit of the science of that.
So basically, like there's 2 forms of the way that these microbes, and when I say microbes, I'm talking about usually bacteria and fungus are our 2 main players in compost. And a lot of times people hear that and think, you know, disease and pathogen, but there's a lot of really beneficial uses of bacteria and fungus. And the main one is breaking down your organic matter into things that can be used by plants. And so when your food goes to a landfill, it's you know, packed really tightly into these anaerobic, no air environments. And that's actually on purpose because they want to generate methane, because a lot of these landfills have methane capture technology. So they're capturing some of the methane that's coming off of this landfill in order to sell it as natural gas. But the issue with that is that you know, this methane capture technology is not always as efficient as we want it to be. And, you know, depending on the amount of organic matter that each landfill is getting, they might not even, you know, take the time to invest in the methane capture. And methane is a greenhouse gas, contributes to global warming, just like carbon dioxide is, but methane is 3 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Methane is really terrible for the environment in itself. And when it breaks down into more carbon dioxide. And so that's why it's really terrible for the environment. So we'd rather reduce the methane and have our waste break down aerobically, which produces carbon dioxide instead of methane.
In small amounts.
In much smaller amounts.
Yeah. And so yeah, we want to keep this waste out of landfills, unless, I mean, there are landfills that are doing this methane capture, so they're intentionally trying to produce more methane in those anaerobic environments so that they can capture methane and sell it or use it for their own energy production. But from what we know, and I'm no expert in landfills necessarily, but that these methane capture systems aren't perfect. They're not capturing 100% of the methane, and usually not even close to that. So, but that technology is improving, so we can actually reap the benefits of some of these landfills. But overall, it's better to compost those things because we can use it to make our soil healthier. Mm-hmm. So why should you compost? So about 1/3 of your household waste is food waste that can be composted. And that's just food waste. I'm not talking about all recyclables. The kind of standard number that we get is 1/3 can be composted, 1/3 can be just traditional recycling, you know, your plastics, your glass, your whatever. And then another third is actual landfill waste, which I've heard predictions in all different directions of, we can recycle 100% with composting and traditional recycling. So I would say in our household, we probably have majority compost. I mean, obviously we have a lot of compost, but we compost, I would say 50% of our waste, maybe more, because we use and we'll get into this, but we use all of our paper, or majority of our paper waste in the compost, as well as carbon matter. So households can really, really, really reduce their waste. And in the long run, there are other benefits. Tax benefits potentially is something that I've heard, that, when landfills fill up, we have to pay for more transportation, another landfill to be built or whatever. And they're very expensive. So there are some potential long-term benefits, tax benefits too, of
some cities
reducing your
programs
waste.
some cities have programs where if you home compost, like I know Washington DC has a program like this, where if you home compost and you buy your home composting kit from the city, and I'm not sure how they check that you're actually doing it, but you can get a tax benefit from that, because they want to reduce the amount of waste that's going to a landfill and encourage people to compost in their own homes.
And one reason to compost that I think people overlook is it's really easy. People get intimidated by composting, and we'll go through all the details and tips and everything, but composting is really forgiving. There are so many times, and actually I feel kind of bad because our compost pile out here, I haven't turned it in a month or two.
Needs a little love.
It should probably be turned a little bit more than that, but it's okay. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to go wrong. It's really, really easy. And again, it's Mother Nature's way of breaking stuff down. You just give her the tools and she'll do it. So, all right. So I want to talk a little bit about modern agricultural practices and some of the reasons why this is important. And actually, I say I'm going to talk about it, but I'm going to hand it over to Reagan to talk about it.
Yeah. So a really important aspect of compost that a lot of people think about is the nutrient profile of compost. So if you think about a traditional large-scale agricultural farm that's making your crops that are going into your, a lot of the grocery stores and chains and things like that, they're using a fertilizer called NPK. NPK is just a shortened way to say nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the big three, what we call macronutrients that plants need in order to grow. And so if you had a soil that was generally pretty unhealthy, like it didn't hold water very well, it had a pretty, either compacted or just really crumbly structure, and it didn't have hardly any nutrients in it natively, you could still grow there by adding your seed and then adding the NPK fertilizer and a bunch of water. But you can almost think of that as agricultural life support. Your crops are on life support, but they're not really, your soil's not really that alive. And so when you add compost to these soils, you're giving them what we call micronutrients. So the things that are, what do you take, vitamins for, your zinc, your magnesium, your small amounts of things that you would usually be getting from your foods. When you have these agricultural fields that you plant a crop and take it out, and that crop is going to a person who's 100 miles away, and then the waste from that crop is going into the trash, that nutrient that was in that field is now 100 miles away and never coming back. So they're going to subsidize that with more NPK, more NPK, more NPK, but our soils are becoming less nutrient diverse because of these practices. So compost is a really good way to take the nutrients that are in your crops already and keep them in the system instead of wasting them and putting them, in the landfills or, whatever. And so it's a really important way to diversify your nutrient profile and make your crops healthier. In addition, phosphorus is considered a limited resource in a way. Currently, right now, it's, you wouldn't hear people say that, but actually 70% of all the phosphorus in the world exists in one mine in Morocco, and they mine it as phosphate rock. And so, when that runs out, it's not the kind of thing that you can get back. It goes into your soil and then it goes into your waterways, and you can't pull it out of the waterways. And so we need to make sure we're keeping these nutrients in the current soil system. So modern agricultural practices could benefit a lot from compost, but it's, you know, it's more labor intensive than just buying a bag of fertilizer at the store and spreading it on your crops and still getting a crop.
Yeah, you'll
and
still
so
get a big plant.
that's something we talk about all the time, is how to incentivize farmers to do these practices that are good for their soils, when what they really care about is just their agricultural yield. And so compost is really, you know, pretty widely adopted in a lot of smaller organic farms, and smaller family farms and homesteading farms and things like that. And a big topic of conversation in the agricultural communities, how to get these practices put into large scale farms, because that's really what the difference is, because compost is important for not just the crops, but also the environment. It helps sequester carbon from the atmosphere and combat global warming, and improves our soil structure, reduces erosion, helps water holding capacity. So it's really important to change these modern agricultural practices and put more of an emphasis on compost.
Like I said, we can talk about this for like days. Well, part of our business model too at Green Heron is, instead of having our own facility where we process the food waste and resell it, we bring it straight to farmers, local farmers. So we work with all these organic local farmers who are really, really awesome. And shout out to those guys if anyone's listening. But they're really great to work with, and we can bring this organic matter. And since they are usually organic farmers, they need compost to fertilize their soil, because they can't use traditional fertilizers that you might buy at the store. So they rely completely on compost and some other amendments to really help their soil. So that's why we take all of the food waste to these partner farms, so that they can use that and hopefully help kind of add nutrients to all of our local soils and make better food for everyone. So let's get into the types of composting. So there are two main types of composting. There's active and there's passive. So active composting is the more common, I would say, more common type of composting. There's a lot of different types of active composting, but you manage the pile regularly, or whatever structure you have. It heats up. You aerate it, which means you're turning it to make sure there's oxygen kind of going in and out. You turn it a good bit, but not too much. We'll go into that a little bit more. But it heats up and, you know, is considered active. So passive, or what a lot of people call cold composting, it doesn't get as hot. It still gets hot in the middle. It is important to note that that does happen, but the compost is built into a pile, or again, whatever structure that it's within, and you kind of layer it in there with your greens and your browns, and then let it sit. It takes a lot longer, but the end product is pretty much the same, and it's still just as healthy. It's just, it might take a couple of years for it to completely break down, whereas an active pile is going to take a lot less time. I mean, depending on the weather, depending on the heat outside, depending on the sunlight, it could take just a month to break down a big pile like that. So it's a very big difference in the amount of time. But what were some of the advantages of passive composting, or composting longer?
So cold composting, you need a lot more browns, first of all, to start with that, because your browns are what's going to give your pile a little bit more structure. If you think about, you know, a pile of, you know, decaying apples, bananas, zucchini, things like that, it's going to be very moist and like kind of, you know, congealed and stuff like that. So when you have a cold pile, in order to keep proper aeration in there, you need a lot more browns, more wood chips, more sticks, things like that, that will space out your pile and allow air to continue in there. One of the main benefits of cold composting is it's easy. Basically, a lot of farmers will just make these big chicken wire enclosures or pallet enclosures and just layer it on, and then come back next year and the compost will be ready. And one of the big advantages of cold composting is you get a lot more fungal activity. So active composting, you get a lot more bacterial activity, and passive composting, you get more fungal activity. One's not necessarily better than the other, but fungi are really good for kind of making networks of nutrient pathways and holding water and things like that. So the reason that the cold composting promotes more fungal activity is because it's not moving. And if you think about fungus, we have this one type of fungus called mycelia that will build these really long
chains.
Yeah, it looks like
Root
almost like
systems?
strings. And so
Yeah.
like if you go to like an old wood chip pile, for example, that's been sitting for a couple of years and you pull it apart, there might be some like white
All
and it looks
spread
like
through,
chains.
yeah.
You can see it kind of sticking together. That's the fungal network. And so when you're not turning it and you're not disrupting that, you have a lot more chance for that fungal network to grow. It's not necessarily any better or worse than the active composting. It's just a different type of, microbial community that's growing there. So if you want a more fungal-based community, you can do cold composting and it will break down just as well. Whereas the active, you're going to get more of the bacteria because you're not going to, tear them apart when you're turning it over.
Yeah. And again, active composting just happens a lot faster.
Yeah, so. If you need compost within a month, you better be
right. All right, so a little bit more on the types of composting. So those are the two main types of composting, are active and passive, but within that, there are so many different styles of composting. I'm just gonna talk about these main four because there really are, humans are so clever. We've figured out so many cool ways of composting, but as far as backyard composting, and that's what we're gonna focus on today, piles, just creating a pile, and you can have tons of different structures with those piles. And then tumblers are the other method that's really common in backyard method. And a tumbler is, well, there are a lot of different types of tumblers too, but it's just a little enclosed rolling barrel essentially. And the advantage of tumblers is you can put a little less in there. You don't have to build up the pile as much. And then of course, turning it is really easy because all you have to do is grab the handle and turn the little lever and it turns your pile for you. One of the things that a lot of people, or one of the issues that a lot of people run into with tumblers is they end up turning it too much. And actually, shout out to my mom. She did that. She started composting, of course, and she was turning her tumbler just a little too much. It wasn't breaking down because it was aerating too much. It didn't have time to build up heat. So again, we'll talk about heat a little bit more, but the different styles or different types of composting. We have the industrial composting, the commercial anaerobic composting, and that's also, like we said, with the landfills, they get all of that organic matter and they put it in an anaerobic or an oxygenless enclosure and then capture the methane that's coming out. So a lot of those industrial operations are doing that method. Of course, like I said, that's not what we do. We just deliver everything to local farms. Vermiculture is really fun. It's worm composting. So that if you're not afraid of worms, which I run into a lot of people who are afraid of worms, I want you to know they don't bite. But I totally understand if that's really gross for you. But vermiculture is a really great way to compost inside, potentially. You can do it outside, of course, but it's essentially a bucket system where you put a bunch of worms into a bucket and then you gradually feed them your food waste, and you layer in some newspapers and some of that carbon matter as well, but it's mostly just food waste. And it usually goes really quickly because those worms are going to start digesting everything in that bucket, and the casings from the worms are actually what's used for all that extra nutrients. So worm poop is what's really going to give you the end product there. But vermiculture is a nice small scale. I mean, if you only have a small space, it's a great way to compost. The other way to compost in a small space or inside is compost tea. And it's a little different. It's very different, in fact, from regular composting, like in your backyard, because it's all food waste. There's no carbon matter in it. And your final project, it kind of ferments. There are some kits that you can buy. I wouldn't try this without a kit, but there's a fermentation process with this. And the end product is a liquid that you can actually just pour onto your garden or onto your soil or whatever you're trying to amend or improve. But today, I want to focus on just backyard composting, tumblers, things like that, because I think that's a little more applicable. But if you guys have questions about vermiculture and compost tea, you can save that for the end. We'll do a little Q&A. And I must admit, I'm not very experienced at compost tea or vermiculture, but I know enough about it to advise you all a little bit more. So getting into how to start a compost pile. What do you need to do? What are the basics of this? So we'll go through all these questions. So again, I want to really drive home, starting an active compost pile is really easy and very forgiving. So we'll go over what goes in, the do's and don'ts of what can go in your pile and why, and then where it should go, what location in your yard, or if you're in an apartment and you have a little patio, you can use a tumbler there. So there are a lot of options. We'll go over how big should it be and why, and then how do you start building it? What's the actual starting point here? So what goes in? This is the most common question we get, and it's pretty simple, but there are some outliers sometimes. So things that go in, the general rule, and this is what I like to tell people when they ask me, is if it grows, it goes. If it's a plant or it was a plant, it likely can go into your compost. So if you think of what can a vegetarian eat, anything that doesn't have meat, most vegetarian foods, obviously no dairy, I would say all vegan foods, but there are some things like honey and stuff that I guess vegans don't eat. And so anyway, honey can go into your compost. So, and then eggs and things like that. So most vegetarian foods, but no dairy, paper products. This is your cardboard, your junk mail, your paper towels, things like that. They can go right into your compost. So you don't want anything that has cleaner on it. And you'll see in the what doesn't go in is no cleaners. If you're using a paper towel, you put some bleach on it, you wipe down whatever. That should definitely not go in. We don't want chemicals like that in our compost pile. They can disrupt the bacteria colony and really hurt that process a lot. So cleaners and chemicals are just a no-go unless they're organic. And I mean, even still, you probably wouldn't want to do that unless you know exactly what's in that cleaner. So, but let's see, lint and dust. This is something that people don't necessarily know about, is your dryer lint. You can just throw that into your compost. It's actually really nice for controlling your moisture content. If there's like a lot of moisture in your compost, lint and dust really helps balance that out. So even the vacuum cleaner, unless there's any little plastic pieces or debris that's been picked up that can't go in the compost, I'll just dump that in too. Again, it's a great way to balance out moisture. It's the dust from your house. We have a cat and a dog and the two of us, so there's a lot of hair around the house, so we can just put that hair, our hair, dog and cat hair, all goes into the compost. And then your yard waste. So your leaves are the best carbon that you can put into your compost. They break down really quickly. They're really, like when they're dry and crumbly, it's so satisfying. And I don't know if anyone else is very satisfied by that, but yes, yard waste is great. And
an important exception to yard waste is if your yard is treated with insecticides, pesticides, herbicides, things like that.
Roundup.
Things like that.
I would use Roundup.
Just don't do it in general. But if you use any kind of weed killer or insect spray or anything like that on your yard, do not put it in your compost, because it will end up in your compost and you're going to put it on your garden and you're going to be like, why isn't my garden growing? And you'd be like, oh, I have my herbicide in there and that's why. Yeah. So make sure you're really careful about not putting anything that's been treated like that into your yard waste, because it's not going to, break down. It's chemicals. So,
and there's one exception with leaves as well, and I want to talk about the food pesticides as well real quick. But with leaves, there are certain leaves, oak leaves, I believe, are the main issue, but they actually are meant, or the tree itself is trying to kill all the other things around it. It's competition for water and nutrients, and so when the leaves fall, they kill the grass, they kill all the other plants that are around it. Those leaves are meant to kind of poison those things. So you want to limit or just keep those leaves out of your compost, because they might end up killing what you're trying to grow.
And grass clippings are good, but they have to be kind of dried out and separated, because if they, if you have a big pile of grass and then it kind of all sticks together and you end up with a little pocket of no air, and then your composting stops in there. So you spread out your grass, things like that. So just like little things that you learn as you keep doing it. Like, oh, I should have dried that grass out. I should have spread it out, things like that.
And if you're taking up your garden, like if you're switching garden plants for the season. I know we kind of seasonally switch out our plants in our garden, and so we'll just take everything out, throw it straight into the compost pile. But I know we're not using any sort of pesticides or anything on our garden. But Reagan, can you tell us a little bit about the pesticides used for food and how that differs from the Roundup and stuff that you would use on your yard?
Yeah, so using pesticides, herbicides, things like that, it's obviously, if you're buying your groceries from the grocery store and you're not buying things that specifically say they're not treated with that kind of thing, you're going to get food that's treated with pesticides, insecticides, things like that. But because of the food safety regulations in our country, we have you're not going to end up with a piece of fruit or vegetable that's completely covered in pesticide or insecticide when you they're washed, because of our food safety regulations in our country. And I would hope that you wash your own fruits and vegetables as well before you eat them. So that's not something I worry about when it comes to your food waste. If you bought something at the grocery store, it can go in.
Yeah. But and the difference with yard waste is you're not washing off that Roundup from the weeds you pulled or whatever. So, but a little bit more about what does and doesn't go in. So things that are great to put in your compost, and actually how we collect our compost, we have a little 5-gallon bucket with a lid in our kitchen and dump everything in, close it up. You don't want to compost in this bucket. You take it outside and add it to the pile. But a 5-gallon bucket is more than enough. We put in, of course, our Lint and Dust, all of our food waste. I actually keep a paper shredder right next to my compost, so I can just grab a big handful of shredded paper and put it in. It's great to break down, start breaking down these foods and these items before you put them into your compost pile. Anything you can do to break it up before you put it in your pile is going to make that process go a little bit faster, because it's less that the pile has to do. But we will add coffee grounds every single day. It actually makes it smell a little bit good.
Yeah.
The lint definitely makes it smell better too when you get it straight from the dryer, and it smells like that nice, clean laundry, and put that into your bin. It really makes it smell a lot better. And it shouldn't smell too terrible, but we'll get into that a little bit more. Things that shouldn't go in: no meat, no meat, no dairy, no oil, and of course we've talked about no cleaners. The reason why we don't want meat and dairy is it kind of putrefies. When it's breaking down, and it will compost. I mean, don't get me wrong. You can compost.
Organic matter will break down, period.
You can compost it.
But you're going to get a nasty pile.
Right. If you don't mind the smell, and it will definitely attract a lot more critters than you normally would. But if you don't mind that, you can absolutely compost.
That's a much higher rate for pathogens.
Yes. There are some dangers of pathogens with that. And actually, will you explain pathogens in the pile? And actually, we'll talk about that in a minute, because I have a slide for it. So we'll keep going. But oils, why can't you put oils in?
Oil will essentially coat whatever material that you're trying to break down. So if you have a nice, beautiful leaf that you're trying to get your bacteria to break down, and you coat it with oil, it's essentially like a fatty layer that your bacteria can't get through to access that plant. If you think about a leaf out in the wild, a lot of them have that, especially like ground plants where they're really susceptible to bugs, have kind of a waxy finish. That's a finish that helps protect against bacteria and insects and things like that can go straight through that waxy layer. And so when you add cooking oils, you think, oh, well, my, vegetable oil, has the word vegetable in it. Put it in. Don't put it in, because it's going to coat your organic matter in a way that makes it inaccessible for breaking down.
Yeah. So, and a little bit of oil is not a big deal. If you cook something in oil, as long as you drain the oil off, try to get some of that oil off, because it will still break down. It just takes longer for the bacteria to be able to penetrate that item. So limit the amount of oil to the minimum possible. But again, if you cook something in oil, go ahead and throw it in. Don't put that into the landfill. It'll still break down and it'll be okay. So yep. So okay.
Yeah.
So where should it go? This is, again, a pretty forgiving thing. If you're putting something in your backyard, putting a compost pile in your backyard, and just for clarity's sake, I'm not talking about tumblers right now. I'm just talking about an active compost pile. No matter how you enclose that, or if you enclose it, or if you tarp it, or whatever, it should go in some place that has kind of partial sun, partial shade. If it's a little more in the sun, it's okay. If it's a little more in the shade, it's okay. Again, this is very forgiving, but you want to make sure that it is getting sunlight, but it's not drying out completely. It's gonna get hot, so being in the sun just helps it heat up even more, speeds up that process a little bit. You want to keep it away from waterways, which are rivers, creeks, lakes, ponds, whatever, the natural waterways. You don't want that drainage going in there directly. It needs drainage so that the moisture can kind of go back into the earth or somewhere else, so that we can balance out the moisture content. But we keep our piles, I don't know, we have a little creek in the backyard. So we know eventually that water is going into the creek, but we keep it far enough away that we know the moisture draining out of our compost pile is going through the soil and filtering through the soil before it goes into the waterway, that small creek in our backyard. So we know that there's no direct contact there. You want to pick a flat area, just because turning it is going to be a lot easier. You also want to put it in a flat area so that there aren't like pockets of moisture. You don't want a little puddle to kind of form within your compost. So again, flat is the way to go. Convenience, I see it all the time that people don't want a compost pile next to their house because they think it'll smell, it'll be gross, whatever. And we'll go over this, but it shouldn't be gross. It shouldn't really smell. And it's nice to have it next to your house. I mean, if you can walk
put it too far away, you're never going to go turn it.
Right. If you put it near your house, you're more motivated to turn it. It's a lot easier to collect, all of your food waste and just dump it in, walk it out and dump it in. So I always suggest, it depends obviously on where you're at, what your backyard looks like, but I would say keep it close to whatever back door or whatever is closest to the kitchen, or just whatever is the most convenient, and especially convenient for turning. The other convenience you can have, and actually how we've set up our piles, is near the shed in our backyard, because that's where all the tools are. You'll definitely want a pitchfork, shovel. Well, if you're turning this by hand, if you happen to have a small tractor or something, that would be very fancy. That actually makes it a lot easier. We don't have a tractor in our yard, but we do everything by hand in our yard. So it's a lot of manual labor, but it's a great benefit at the end of the day. So convenience really is up to your discretion, but I definitely think you should do a convenient pile. So as far as size, they can really, really vary, but 1 square yard is kind of the minimum pile that you want to have, because that's going to be enough space that heat can really generate in the middle of your pile. So in order to generate enough heat to really break it down, you want to build it up to that, square or cubed yard, I guess. It would be a cubed yard, not a square yard, but you know what I mean. So around the size that you see in this image is probably a cubed yard. And actually this system that you're seeing here, it looks like a 3 system compost pile. So they have their newest stuff all the way to the right. So you can see it's all green over there, and then in the middle, it looks pretty much done. But what people will do with those structures is take them apart, flip them, put them back in, and then it stays nice and uniform. And as you can see, this particular setup has slots in it, so there's still a lot of airflow that can hit the sides of it. And so you want to maximize that airflow as much as possible. And then on the bottom, you want to have it touching the ground, or I really like having my piles just touching the ground, because worms come up from underneath, and insects and all sorts of fun critters come up from underneath, and they'll actually kind of dig through the pile and help aerate it and break it down a little bit more. But aside from that, I mean, you can have really big piles. I mean, there are windrows that, go miles. So, I mean, that's an exaggeration, but are huge, huge, huge piles. But you generally don't want to, you want to make it manageable so that you can actually flip it regularly. If you have a giant pile that takes up your whole backyard and it's all one big pile, it's really hard to flip it. And you want to have stages of different compost, because as you're adding more and more to your compost pile, all of that stuff needs to break down. So you want to have a few separate piles usually. And actually, if you do a tumbler system, you want a tumbler that at least has two separate compartments. So you can have a new stuff and an old stuff. So your new stuff is all the fresh food waste that you're putting on there and all of that. And then the old stuff stays in a pile and continues to mature. How to build it? We always say build lasagna. So you layer it. You want to layer the nitrogen and carbon matter. Those are your greens and your browns. So it's a 1-to-3 ratio. So nitrogens are usually your food waste, the green waste. Carbons are more of the yard waste. And in here, the carbons are straw in the middle, leaves. It looks like maybe there's some wood chips too. Some grass clippings would actually be a little bit more on the green side. But you want to balance it out to where these nitrogen-rich foods or nitrogen-rich waste is being balanced out by the carbons. And as you mess around with your own compost pile, you'll kind of figure out what your pile needs. It'll tell you what it needs. Actually, it's my next point. But the nitrogen to carbon ratio, you can play with that a lot. It's going to be balancing out the moisture content. You'll see it breaking down. And actually the next point is you'll want to aerate it and make sure that it's staying hot. That heat breaks down or can eliminate a lot of pathogens as well. So Reagan, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
So basically, when you have this compost pile and it's getting really hot in the middle. The reason it's getting hot in the middle is because the bacteria and fungi are metabolizing. They're breaking down your waste, and as they, break down your waste, and they, they produce biomass from that, and they're, breaking it down into things that plants can use. They're generating essentially body heat, just like we do. Like when you're running, you generate body heat, and so what happens with this pile is that the pile will, start cold. You'll have all your matter in there, and it'll start breaking down. Well, as more bacteria and fungi start to break down this pile, it starts heating up with everybody's body heat in there, getting really, really hot. And so what happens is you have a shift in who's living there, right? So a lot of the bacteria that we think of as pathogens, things that can cause disease, like to exist in a pretty, room temperature, they would call them mesophiles, like in the middle of the temperature environment. That's why, you have the danger zone with food, where you don't leave it out on the counter and things like that. But as the pile gets hotter and hotter, these types of pathogenic bacteria can't survive anymore. And you have a shift to what you call thermophiles, or bacteria that like it to be really hot. And so you're going to have a community that's full of more of these thermophiles, and your pathogens will have been killed off by that heat. Not because the heat is like physically killing them, but because they can't survive. They don't, reproduce in those conditions and stuff. So you want to make sure that your pile gets nice and hot to make sure that you're not having any pathogens in your pile. And it also helps with things like insects and things like that. Again, the insects aren't going to live when it's really hot, so you're not going to get like nasty larvae or anything like that if your pile gets nice and hot.
And the importance of aerating, again, is adding oxygen to it. It makes that process continue. And mixing up the pile too helps everything else break down, because the inside of the pile is what's really breaking down. So you want to make sure that you're kind of cycling through, you know, what's in the middle, what's in that high heat spot. A lot of times you'll see, you know, that banana peel still sitting on top of the pile, and you're like, well, why is this not breaking down? Well, probably needs to go into the middle of the pile before it'll really break down. And that's why it's very important that, you know, every time you add that green waste, the food waste to your pile, you put carbons on top of it to make sure that it starts to break down, because your green waste is what's going to make it get hot. And if for some reason your pile is too much carbon content, it won't get hot. So you'll know, because you can test the temperature when you're turning the pile. It won't be steaming. Yeah. Like it should be steaming.
If we went out there today and turned our pile, it'd be steaming.
It'd be really steaming, especially with how cold it is. So you will get a lot of visitors to your compost pile, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it can be. Worms, yes, you definitely want worms. Worms are awesome. Raccoons, he's just so cute with his little hand. Mice, rats, birds, groundhogs, every little critter out there is going to be very interested in all this waste that you've put back here. And actually, one reason why we limit and don't actually compost the meat and dairy is because it attracts a lot of those. That smell will really attract them. So some people have gotten bears in their compost piles.
Well, we got a question about how to deter bears. And like, that one's up to you.
How do I keep bears out of my compost pile? It's like,
but you shouldn't worry too much about these visitors. You know, a lot of times when you get like raccoons, groundhogs, things like that, people are like, oh, dirty outside animal, etc. But they're going to come right when you put fresh compost on, right? So if we have a nice new bucket, it's got all these food scraps and stuff, I'll put it into a beautiful pile and come back the next day and it's just scattered everywhere. And that's because the groundhogs and the raccoons and stuff want it. But as soon as it starts breaking down, they don't care. So it's going to get to that high heat point after they've touched it, and it's going to eliminate the pathogens if there are any to begin with, which they're not.
And so there are folks who have had problems with mice and rat infestations.
That's a whole different.
And that's, and a lot of times that's because the pile's not hot enough, or when that pile heats up, mice and rats won't live in there because it's too hot. So if for some reason you're struggling with a mice or rat infestation in your pile, we can talk about that in the Q&A session. But a lot of times just keeping it really hot is going to prevent those guys from actually settling in there and saying, wow, this is actually a nice home. Other little critters, you get lots of insects. Insects are great because they dig around and eat a lot of that stuff. Birds are great because they, eat the worms and they use their feet to kind of scratch in, and
they do the work for you.
A lot of them do kind of a heavy lifting, especially in the winter when I don't want to go out there and turn that pile. I'll just say like, hey, groundhogs, help me out. Go over there and start digging around a little bit, will you? So visitors are not a bad thing, but in moderation, of course. Smells. So means your pile is trying to tell you something. So if your pile is super smelly and it smells like methane or like farts, there's like no other way to say that. If it's smelling really bad, it probably needs more carbon content.
It's probably too wet.
Well, yeah, and that's the other thing. So it should smell earthy. So when you're turning it, the earthy smell of when you're in a forest and you can smell all the lichen and the trees and everything, it should smell really earthy. If you're digging around a really fertile soil, it should smell pretty similar to that, but moisture content is very, very important. So the moisture content should be, moist, but not wet. You shouldn't be able to squeeze, wring it out and have, water droplets or liquid coming out of it. But it should always be moist to the touch. If it's dry, it's probably not working. And that's, again, one of those key components that we talked about in the beginning was water or moisture, because that's really going to help balance out that pile chemistry to make it actually work better.
If it's too dry, the water is what allows contact between bacteria and your food waste and fungi in your food waste. That's where the bacteria are living, is in that moisture content. But if it's too wet, all of the air pockets are blocked off, and then all of a sudden there's no oxygen, so you have an anaerobic environment. So you want it right in the middle.
Yeah. Let's see. I think, okay. When the compost is completed, it's actually pretty easy to tell. You can let compost mature for as long as you want, and it's just going to get more and more nutrient dense. But it'll completely break down. A lot of times the pile will be about a third of the size of the original pile, if not less. And it really breaks down into a much smaller space. And then the temperature will drop. So when it goes from that 120 degrees plus range down to less than 120 degrees, then it's probably done. And if for some reason it doesn't look done, you can always add more greens to it. If there's a lot of sticks and a lot of wood chips and that stuff hasn't broken down at all, then add more greens to it and heat it back up and keep turning it. So you can kind of balance it out. If it doesn't look done,
always troubleshoot,
but it's stopped, then you can keep it going. You can always give it a little bit more food. But you'll know when it's done because it'll be a really rich kind of brown black color like you see here. The food, you shouldn't be able to recognize any of the food that's been put in there. You shouldn't see that banana peel. It should be completely gone, unrecognizable. And you can actually test to see if it's done by just taking a scoop and putting it in a plastic bag. And if the plastic bag grows and kind of inflates over like an hour or so, then it's probably not done because it's producing a lot of gaseous matter. So you can just plop it back in and say, all right, it's not done yet. But usually the temperature is going to be the main indicator there. So what do you do with it when it's all done? Sift it. You want to get all those large pieces of sticks and stuff. There's always a few things that take longer to break down. So you sift it, and then you can apply it to your garden, apply it to your yard, mix it with soil to use for potting soil. There are tons of different ways you can use this. If you're starting a raised bed garden, which a lot of people start a raised bed with compost and the soil that they have. So I would mix 50-50 compost to soil. If you have a garden and you're just applying some additional compost to it, maybe between growing seasons or whatever, then you can just kind of apply it to the top. Instead of trying to really mix it in, you shouldn't be like tilling your soil. You want to keep the nutrients in there that are in there. So you want to just kind of apply that to the top. And then a lot of times people will put a layer of wood chips over top or a wood chips underneath or whatever. There are tons, again, it's very forgiving. So you can do it. It doesn't have to be the perfect, weighing the scales 50-50, just eyeball it and put it in there. You're not going to be doing anything wrong. So is there anything else? I think that's our last slide here. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and then we can take questions.
Kat, I have a question here from Kyle, who is wondering if it's advisable to add invasive plant garden waste to a compost pile.
It shouldn't matter that much. I mean,
so the thing is, when you
weeds and seeds.
Weeds and seeds, that's one thing we didn't cover. That's a great question. That's another thing that can be killed by those temperatures. And so when you have, like, if you have like a ton of weeds or something like that, and you throw them in your compost pile and you make sure it gets to that high heat, a lot of times that really high heat is going to kill off those weed seeds so that they don't germinate when you put down your compost pile. So typically I would always say, pull out your invasives and throw them in. It's a good way to kill them.
Yeah, it's a great way to kill them. So, but that, if it's a cold compost pile, that'd be a lot different because that's probably just going to start growing in your compost pile. And actually, fun fact, when plants grow in your compost pile, it's called volunteers. I've had a couple potato volunteers grow in my compost pile. It's really common to have things grow in your compost pile. I mean, you're putting in all of that, all of those plants and seeds and things. So they might start growing. I just take them out, put them in the middle. But yeah, I thought it was kind of fun being in Knoxville and Tennessee and having volunteers grow in our compost. What other questions? did you guys have?
So we have a question from Jennifer, who was wondering how often you need to turn the compost pile.
So
when you
depends.
first
Yeah.
started, when you first started, you could turn it every day almost.
So yeah, when you first start, I wouldn't say every day. I would say once a week. I mean, when you first started, you could turn it every day. I'd say that's a little bit much, maybe every few days. You want to let it settle and you want to let it heat up. So the way to test if you're turning it enough or not is the heat on the inside of the compost pile. So if it's really hot, let it be hot for a week or two. If it starts to cool down, give it a turn. I would say once a week is kind of the general rule of thumb with a big compost pile. If you're doing that yard cubed, then you probably want to turn once a week. But when it gets closer to the end of the composting process, I will let my piles mature a little bit and I don't turn them hardly at all, maybe once or twice. Once they've mostly broken down, I'll let it just sit for a month and it'll decompose even more and then turn it again. And all of a sudden it's that really rich, black compost that you like. And a lot of times I'll reuse my compost in the next pile. So if I go through and turn it and a lot of it's done, but not all of it's done, I'll leave the stuff that's not done or add it to whatever new pile I have and I'll take out the stuff that's done. So I would say general once a week. If it's really cold outside, you might want to do it a little less or put a tarp over it. A black tarp can really help heat it up in the winter and holds in the moisture when it's a little more dry outside. Sorry, other questions. I'll ramble on forever.
That's okay. We appreciate it. So Jonathan has a question about any tips on apartment or small space composting.
Yeah, so we talked about vermiculture. If you like worms or are okay with worms, look up vermiculture. There are kits you can buy. You can also look up Compost Tea, which was one of the other options we talked about. And that's, again, you want to probably go with a kit because there are some specific things you need to put in there to actually make sure that your food is fermenting properly. And then there's usually a little tap at the bottom and you just, whatever liquid is in there, you put it into a cup and toss it on your garden or whatever. And so those are really good indoor, small scale. But if you have an apartment with a patio, you can get a tumbler that fits on your patio.
They don't have to be that big.
Yeah, they don't have to be big at all.
That's the advantage of the tumblers. The pile has to be, the cubic meter, but the tumbler can be, not too big.
And what's great is the tumbler kind of generates its own heat because a lot of times they're almost always black tumblers. And so any sunlight that hits it is going to warm the inside of it. And the issue with tumblers is when it's cold outside, it's really probably not going to generate enough heat to continue composting. You kind of have to wait to the spring to actually see it breaking down. But the tumbler is really the best option. It's probably the easiest option. So if you're allowed to have a small tumbler on your patio or whatever, then
you can also get your
really
compost picked up.
Heron Compost. There's also a service. But we do residential compost pickup service is our main service for people who live in apartments and don't have a lot of options like that.
And I actually live in a house and I still use their service. Then we have a question from Jennifer wondering if ink on junk mail, newspaper, or cardboard is bad in the compost.
So the general rule that I follow, yes and no. The ink on regular paper is probably fine. Glossy paper, anything that has the gloss on the outside, the cardboard that has gloss on the outside, don't put it in. It just doesn't really break down. I mean,
it's the same idea as the oil. It's inaccessible.
Yeah. The bacteria just can't get through it that well. And it will eventually break down again. I mean, someday, but it is a lot harder for that bacteria to get into that area and break it down. And I know there are some chemicals on it that probably aren't good, but I don't know them off the top of my head. But on that note, we recycle most of our paper into the compost pile. It's really just those those few boxes that we get that have that glossy outside that you can sometimes peel it off. It's a little bit of a tedious process. I'd rather just throw it into the recycling bin, but I have peeled off that outer layer before and composted it.
Great. Okay, Eric was wondering if you could just go over the subject of dealing with a bad smell again. He said, I think it was because it was too wet.
Okay, there are a lot of different things that could be going on, but the two most common problems that make your compost pile smell are moisture content. It's too wet, it'll start smelling, or there's too much of the nitrogen, the greens, food waste in there. So either way, the best way to combat that is to have, add leaves, add carbon matter. You can even add things that smell kind of good. I mean, that drier lint, obviously you wouldn't have enough, but if your pile's really, really smelling kind of putrid, then you want to turn it and add carbon matter to every part of it. You want to make sure that there might be big aggregates kind of stuck together of just gross looking stuff. You want to try to break it up as much as possible, get it out of that wet pile that it's in, and then rebuild it with more carbon content. So the best thing, dry leaves really, really help with that. So I would always say dry leaves or a lot of paper will fix that problem. But just keep adding that carbon content until either it's a little bit drier or stops smelling.
Yeah, I think that the smell comes from a lot of times what we think of as like fermentation. Like if you open up an avocado and it smells absolutely putrid, like that's fermentation. And that's a lot of times kind of the similar smell as to what you get in your compost pile when there's too much nitrogen content. So what you really just need is more browns and more air.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. We also have a question from Madeline Rogero. Where can you purchase worms in Knoxville? A few years ago, we got some from Bob Grimmick, but I'm not sure if he's still raising them.
That is a really good question, and I don't have the answer.
I'm not necessarily in the worm business.
Let me think, because there is a partner farm that's doing some vermiculture. I can't remember. I'm sorry. We can look it up and send that and post it about some options for that. But I know you can order worms online and get them in the mail.
Get them shipped straight to your door.
Right. But yeah, I think local worms are a little bit better. But the red wigglers are the ones you want to look for. That is literally their name, red wigglers.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. And we can also probably post in the event page after the fact too, if
awesome.
we get some local stuff. So we have another question from Kyle. I have a lot of oak trees. What should I do with the leaves since they do need to be raked? Would it be good to use these in areas where I need weed control?
Yeah, so rake them around the trees. If you want to have kind of a natural mulch area around your trees to kill the grass, wherever you don't want grass, rake those leaves. I don't think anyone should get their leaves picked up.
Well, in Knoxville, they mulch them.
Well, yeah, but you can use them in your yard, is what I'm saying, is you can save on those resources. And
no, I feel so bad for the trees. They work so hard all year to grow those beautiful leaves, and they take them away.
And then we're just like, goodbye. So the oak leaves especially, because those are really big and heavy, they're great for just, if you have mulch areas, just rake them onto that mulch area. And then a lot of people think you have to have like pretty mulching done in your yard, but you can get wood chips for free from a lot of places, or Chip Drop is a free service, and they'll actually drop wood chips at your house, and you can use that to put over your leaves in those mulch areas, keeps the leaves from blowing away and all of that. And again, that'll just compost down and make those areas a lot more fertile.
Yeah, what I've seen a lot of recently is when people just take the leaves and rake them right around the base of the tree. So you still have your, lawn, and it looks very nice, but your tree still gets back and all the work you put into those leaves all year.
Yeah. And if you want to make it really pretty, you can put some planks of wood around it and kind of frame it in and make it look like a nice little natural area.
Okay, so I just wanted to say really quickly before the next question, we do have a few, it looks like this has generated a lot of questions, which is great. I just wanted to give anybody who needs to the okay to log off, because we are recording this and we'll be posting it later. Okay, so the next question is from Lana. Would you talk about the pickup service for compost here in Knoxville?
Of course. Of course I will. So we actually started this business in 2019, September 2019. So it's a very new business. A few little changes throughout the year and a half since we started, but it's almost exclusively residential compost pickup. So the way the business works is you go online, and we are going to be making some changes to this process here soon, but go online, register your location, your address, and then we look up that address, make sure it's within our range. We serve all of Knox County, so if you're in the county, you are approved. And make sure that if it's an apartment, it's not a gated community or something that we can't actually get in. And then you'll order what's called the starter bundle, and it's just your bucket where you're going to start collecting things, and we'll deliver it to you. And then you start collecting, and then you schedule pickups online. So you don't have, well, you can opt for a weekly pickup or a regular schedule, but we've kept this business model at a kind of on-demand type of pickup scheduling so that we can save on those fuel costs and fuel emissions, so that we're not going and getting a half full bin from someone. It's going to be completely full every time we get it. And so it's a little bit better for overall transportation, and it just helps add that extra layer of sustainability. But the way, well, we give people a list of things that they can and can't put in the compost bin, and it doesn't actually compost in that 5-gallon bucket. It will kind of sit there and probably start getting a little smelly, and that's when people will order a pickup, and then we'll come to your house or your apartment or wherever and pick it up from your curbside, just like you would a garbage service, and swap it with a new clean bin so that you can start collecting again.
And then we take that compost.
Oh yeah, we take it
to a partner farm.
The local farms. Yeah. So,
and then it goes into their compost to put on the farms and stuff.
And actually, we're working on a little bit of an incentive program to where all of our customers can have a discount on all of the products for our partner farms. So we can help promote the partner farms a little bit more, the local crops and local products that they have. So any other questions?
I'm looking forward to
yeah.
Eric was wondering, have you had to go through the pile to retrieve stuff that is not breaking down, such as pieces of glossy paper and photos?
So, we
yes.
typically pre-screen, like any service, customers aren't going to be perfect about what they put in there. I've spent many an hour peeling a sticker off a piece of fruit, things like that. But typically we try to pre-screen.
Yeah. And, we really haven't had a problem with people putting, plastic and things in the bins. Occasionally we get a little dairy or something. But we'll just take that kind of thing out. But if for some reason a little plastic bag sneaks in and we start turning it and see, oh, wow, there's a plastic bag here, we'll take it out or whatever. But usually when you're turning the pile, you'll see little items that aren't breaking down, or maybe it looked like they were going to break down and they weren't. But part of the sifting process helps with that. So when you sift the compost before you apply it to your garden, that's when you really take a close look at it, because if anything hasn't broken down at that point, it's going to be pretty obvious. So a plastic bag would be really easy to spot in finished compost, or avocado pits. Those take forever to break down. So every time I'm sifting my compost, I get an avocado pit in my little sifter guy. So
and you can always move it to your newer pile. So if you have a pile that you started maybe 2 months ago, 90% of it is broken down really well, but you have a couple really dense pieces of wood, a couple avocado pits, things like that, and you have a brand new pile with fresh greens in it, you can take it and move it to that, because that pile is going to get hotter and heat back up. And so always keeping your things that are more difficult to break down in active piles is a good way to help those kind of move a little more quickly.
Yeah, whatever doesn't break down just goes into the next pile, because you're taking the the little microbes that live in there that are actually breaking down the compost, you just put them into the new compost pile and they're like, oh yes,
The jump start.
there's more. Yeah, there's so much food here for us. So I guess I'm not in the mind of a little bacteria, but.
Okay, so there are 3 more questions. Are you all okay on time to answer those? Or so the next one is, are there any ways to gauge the NPK content of your compost?
That's a good question.
So I'm going to definitely defer to you on this one.
Yes and yes. It depends on how much math you want to do and how much, if you want to pay for it to be sent off. Like if it was a professional compost facility, like an industrial compost facility that's doing it on their own, I know a lot of times they will, they would like to advertise the nutrient profiles of their compost, and so you can send it to a soils lab and get that actually quantified in an analytical sense. Another way you can do it is essentially every single piece of organic matter has its own carbon to nitrogen ratio, and so a certain piece of fruit might have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 27:1. So for every 27 units of carbon, there's 1 unit of nitrogen, things like that. So if you want to do a lot of math, you could kind of go through that and estimate. And there are some estimating calculators online that you can help with that. But in terms of the PK, that you would have to get that analyzed at a lab probably, because it's difficult to know exactly what the input of your starting source is, because you don't know the exact nitrogen or the potassium content of every banana or every apple or things like that. So if you really want to know your actual nutrient breakdown, you would have to send it off to a lab, which isn't too expensive. You can't.
Plenty of farmers do that all the time.
Yeah, you can get an extension specialist to work with you on that.
Okay, the next question is from Cassia. I don't have much of a garden as I live in a small apartment, but have many houseplants. How is it using compost for houseplants?
Oh, so mix it into the potting soil.
Yeah.
You can, anytime you're switching vessels for the houseplants, if they're growing out of whatever pot they're in, as you switch it, add some compost to that to add a little bit more nutrients to it. Or if you're doing any sort of compost tea, you can just pour it in. I mean, it's like watering it too. So, and obviously the compost tea has a lot of moisture content in it. It's because it's liquid.
And if you're not ready to repot your plants and you're not doing compost tea, you just have regular compost tea, you can put it right on the top of your soil. So something that's really great is that, the every time you water it, all of those great nutrients and things like that will move through the soil profile,
seeping through.
Your potted plant profile. So you can just put it right on top, and that's how I recommend that for almost all application. I would almost never recommend tilling, like especially as a soil scientist. You never want to turn up the soil if you can help it. It's always better to just put it on top and let rainfall and nature and your watering do its work. So anytime you're thinking to yourself like, oh, I can't use compost, I just have a yard, like just sprinkle it over your yard and it will work its way through and it will be really beneficial to your yard.
And if you have too much compost to actually put on all your plants, just take it outside and
donate it to a local community garden.
Put it somewhere. Yeah, you can put it anywhere, and you can save it too. Compost will just sit there. I mean, once it's broken down, it'll just continue breaking down a little bit. I mean, it'll continue being compost, so you don't have to use it right away.
Yeah.
Nice. That's really helpful to know, actually. Okay, and so the last question is a multi-parter, so let me know if you need to repeat anything. But Jennifer was wondering, they have a couple of acres of old bramble blackberry bushes. And can they chip or shred it and add it to the compost pile? Is this carbon or nitrogen? Are the thorns okay? Will they break down?
Yes.
So most of that, yeah. I mean, chipping it is always the way to. If you have a chipper, put everything through the chipper before it goes in the compost, because it will increase the surface area.
Some people even have a blender and they blend up all their food waste before they put it in, and that again helps that breakdown process.
I don't have the patience for that.
I don't.
Yeah, excellent if you do.
You have the time to do that, it works. But
it's considered more at that point when it's the fresh greens like that. It would be considered more nitrogen than carbon material. So you would want to make sure you balance that with those drier, woody type things, wood chips and, chipped up sticks and things like that. If you have a wood chipper, just send wood chips through with it.
And as it's breaking down, if you're taking all of that stuff out, you can remove it, let it die and dry out a little bit more, and then chip it up and put it in, and it'll be more of that kind of carbon content at the end of the day.
And then as for the thorns, that's all up to your bravery. I mean, like they'll get broken down just like any other part of the compost, especially if you chip it, but I think that
wear
gloves and use caution. If you have that many acres in a chipper, I would maybe assume you have a tractor and hope that you wouldn't have to handle it manually, but
yes, chip it up, always chip it up. And it depends, the whole nitrogen carbon balance there. I mean, I would think if you just chipped it all up, the entire plant with the trunk or stem and everything, it would probably be relatively well balanced on its own. But a little bit extra dry leaves or wood chips helps that carbon.
I would put
matter.
a little bit of both. I would say it's so in the middle. I would put a little bit of extra food waste on it and a little bit of extra ground waste on it.
And don't be afraid to just put soil on it too. If you have dirt around, put the dirt in there.
Soil is where the starting community of
microbes
lives. And so a lot of times if you have some compost and you start mixing it with a little bit of soil at the beginning, you'll have that kind of base community that can start figuring out what wants to break down what.
But yes, definitely compost those bushes.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That was the last question. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Reagan. That was really informative and very helpful for our community. And we really appreciate you being on with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a blast. Of course, we can always talk about compost forever. So I really, really appreciate you inviting us to do this. And if anyone has any questions, you can reach out to us. We have a Facebook page, Instagram, all of that. And you can also fill out a contact form online. So if anyone has any questions about their own compost, we're happy to help. So
we can do a site visit, things like that.
Yeah, we can actually come to your house.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for attending today. I'm pretty sure I included links in the event page, but I'll go back and make sure that they're all there too if you need help finding anything. But it's Green Heron Compost Services, and I personally use them and really love them, particularly for my laziness. Thank you, Jen.